The movie begins with Tori and Kyle Breyer trying to have a baby. They have fertility books on the shelves about it, but haven't succeeded yet. While they're trying again, Tori feels something vibrate from outside. At first, she ignores it, but then there's a bigger shake that turns off the lights. They look out the window and see something has crashed. The scene then cuts to see clips of a kid named Brandon growing up, crawling and playing. Tori plays hide and seek with him when he's a bit older. Later, at school, Brandon answers a question from the teacher, which catches the attention of a classmate named Caitlin. That night at the farm, while Tori paints, Brandon sleepwalks to the basement where he finds a meteor, the one he likely arrived on Earth in. He becomes agitated and chants angrily as he tries to get closer to it, but Tori calms him down. The next morning, Brandon attempts to mow the lawn but gets frustrated with starting the mower. He ends up flinging it a few hundred feet away. Curious, he approaches it and stops the spinning blade with his hand, without getting hurt. This surprises him, but he doesn't dwell on it for long. Later, the family stops at a diner with Tori, Kyle, Aunt Marilee, and Uncle Noah. When Noah tries to give Brandon a toy gun, Kyle reprimands him. However, Brandon insists on having the gun, and they leave abruptly, with a waitress watching them go. The following morning, Kyle notices Brandon chewing on a fork without any damage to his teeth. Concerned, Kyle takes Brandon hunting, explaining how his body is changing. Tori finds lingerie ads under Brandon's bed, adding to their worries. That night, Brandon stalks Caitlin while listening to music from her laptop. She notices and shuts it off, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. Nervous, she sees that Brandon is watching her from a nearby window. Suddenly, her mother, the waitress from earlier, bursts in asking what's wrong. She begins breathing nervously, pointing at the shadow. Back at the farm, Noah and Tori are looking for Brandon, and they later find him. Brandon's behavior becomes increasingly erratic, and Tori and Kyle struggle to understand what is happening to their son. The next day at school, Tori talks with Brandon's teacher. While at it, Brandon does some mysterious drawings in his notebook. Tori asks about them, and he closes it and walks away. Back at the farm, Kyle notices Brandon straying at the chickens. Concerned, he asks if Brandon is all right, to which Brandon acknowledges that he is. The two then go inside. Later on, Tori and Kyle step outside to find all the chickens murdered. Tori speculates that a wolf might be responsible, but Kyle suspects Brandon, noting that he was outside earlier. At school the next day, Brandon and his classmates participate in a trust fall exercise. Caitlin, still nervous after the previous night's events, hesitates but eventually falls. Unfortunately, one classmate fails to catch Brandon, causing him to hit the ground. Although he's unharmed, Caitlin refuses to help him, calling him a pervert. Brandon denies it, but when the coach forces Caitlin to assist him, Brandon unexpectedly breaks her hand, causing her to scream in pain. In the office, Tori explains to Caitlin's mother that Brandon is sorry and that accidents happen. However, Caitlin's mother remains doubtful and demands the sheriff arrest Brandon. When the sheriff refuses, suggesting special sessions at school instead, Caitlin's mother continues to argue, insisting that Brandon is a psycho. Throughout the confrontation, Brandon sits silently, looking sad. Despite the accusations against him, Tori defends her son, believing in his innocence. Before leaving the diner, Brandon gives Caitlin a menacing stare, sending a shiver down her spine. Later that night, he overhears Kyle and Tori talking about him. Tori, feeling unsettled, starts reading up on meteors, sensing a connection to Brandon's mysterious origins. Suddenly, she notices something strange happening in the barn. Brandon seems to be experiencing something glowing, possibly emanating from the meteor. Concerned, Tori rushes to check on him, only to find him levitating in the barn, chanting ominously. As she approaches, he falls and cuts his hand on part of the meteor. Tori tries to calm him down, but Brandon is hysterical. He accuses her of lying to him and reveals that he came from the sky. In a fit of rage, he runs off into the night, leaving Tori shaken and confused. She rushes to tell Kyle what she discovered, and he's furious. Meanwhile, as Brandon walks along, he screams in frustration, unleashing lasers from his eyes in a display of his growing power. Later, Brandon visits Caitlin in her bedroom, where she sits typing with her injured hand. He reassures her not to be scared and reminds her of their shared connection. Despite her mother's warnings, Caitlin listens intently as Brandon promises to take care of things. She cries as he suddenly disappears, leaving behind a flower as a token of his presence. Meanwhile, at the diner, Caitlin's mother is just finishing closing up shop when she senses something is amiss. Stepping outside, she is startled to see strange diagrams etched onto the windows, reminiscent of those Brandon had drawn in his book. The lights start flickering ominously, and before she can react, the windows shatter, with a piece of glass striking her eye. Despite the pain, she scans the area, sensing a presence nearby. Grabbing a baseball bat for protection, she sees a shadowy figure moving at incredible speed. She swings the bat, but it connects with nothing, and she retreats to the safety of the cooler, locking the door behind her. As she tries to catch her breath, she hears a loud noise as Brandon uses his laser vision to burn through the door. With a menacing glare, he tears the door off its hinges, his intent clear. Before she can react, he charges at her, and the scene fades to black, leaving her fate uncertain. Probably dead. The next morning, Brandon meets with his parents, reassuring them that everything is fine and explaining away the events of the previous night. Meanwhile, a sheriff and his deputy investigate the diner, including the gruesome scene left behind. Among the wreckage, the sheriff locates one of the diagrams drawn by Brandon on the window, adding to the mystery. Marilee, who is also a counselor, attempts to talk to Brandon, sensing that there is more to the situation than meets the eye. But Brandon is despondent during the counseling session, unable to articulate what's truly going on inside him. Despite Marilee's efforts, the session leads nowhere, leaving her contemplating involving the police due to Brandon's concerning behavior. Meanwhile, at a bar, Kyle confides in his friends about the incident involving Caitlin's hand, expressing growing fear and doubt about his son's nature. Back at home, as the lights flicker on and off, Marilee experiences a moment of unease in the bathroom. Later, Brandon shows up at Marilee's house, insisting on talking to her and warning against involving the police. Despite her attempts to send him away, Brandon lingers outside her window, watching her text Noah. When Noah returns unexpectedly and finds Brandon in the closet, tensions escalate. Noah tries to force Brandon into his truck, but Brandon responds with a sudden display of strength, throwing Noah against the garage door. As Noah drives away in fear, convinced that Brandon is following him, the atmosphere becomes increasingly tense and foreboding. Suddenly, the truck starts swerving out of control, and Noah struggles to regain power. Panic sets in as he attempts to restart it, but Brandon materializes in front of him. Noah screams in terror as Brandon effortlessly lifts the truck off the ground, levitating it in the air before sending it crashing down with a deafening impact. In the chaos, Noah's jaw is viscerally broken, leaving him mortally wounded. As Noah lies there, dying, Brandon draws another one of his mysterious symbols in the ground with Noah's blood. With a cold demeanor, Brandon returns home, casually explaining to his parents that he was playing soccer the whole time. He recounts a fabricated story of being bullied, using it to explain the torn shirt he wears. That night, Kyle is haunted by a nightmare revealing the moment when Tori first found the baby in the meteor and chose to adopt him. However, the nightmare takes a chilling turn when the baby's eyes suddenly light up with lasers, startling Kyle awake. The phone rings, and Kyle and Tori are called to the hospital, where they find Marilee distraught, explaining Noah's tragic death. Marilee's revelation that Brandon had visited Noah beforehand deeply concerns Kyle. The next morning, they break the news to Brandon, but his indifferent response leaves Kyle suspicious. Accusations fly, and tensions rise as Kyle confronts Brandon, who reacts with surprising force, shoving his father into the pantry and breaking the doors in the process. Tori intervenes, sending Brandon away, but the incident leaves Kyle shaken and wary of his son. Later, Kyle discovers Brandon's shirt, noticing a small amount of blood on it. He manages to conceal it when Brandon returns from the shower. Faking an apology for earlier just to hide the shirt, Brandon just says okay to Kyle's apology. Later, Kyle confides in Tori about what he found, but she adamantly refuses to entertain the possibility of their son's involvement in Noah's death. Meanwhile, the sheriff meticulously examines the accident scene, noticing striking resemblances between the diagram from the window and the symbols drawn on the ground. Kyle sifts through old birthday cards belonging to Brandon, desperately seeking solace and understanding. That night, tormented by her husband's suspicions, Tori stumbles upon Brandon's notebook. Her heart races as she discovers eerie drawings depicting the symbols from the window, the road, Brandon's peculiar outfit, and unsettling imagery of dead figures alongside the ominous words, "Take the world." The next day, Kyle decides to take Brandon on a hunting trip, hoping for some semblance of bonding and clarity. Meanwhile, the sheriff pays Tori a visit, presenting her with damning evidence from the accident scene. Though she refuses to acknowledge the truth, the sheriff vows to return with answers. In the woods, as Brandon and Kyle track deer, tension simmers beneath the surface. Brandon ventures ahead to investigate tracks, unaware of his father's mounting suspicions. Suddenly, Kyle raises his rifle, aiming at Brandon. The shot rings out, but to Kyle's horror, the bullet merely ricochets off Brandon's head, leaving him unscathed. A look of shock crosses Brandon's face as Kyle fumbles to reload. Once Kyle manages to reload, Brandon vanishes into thin air, leaving behind a sense of dread and uncertainty lingering in the dense forest. Kyle runs in a panic through the woods, but Brandon, hooded once more, effortlessly flies around him, tauntingly appearing and disappearing. Finally, Kyle tackles him, desperate to reason with his son. He tries to apologize, but Brandon's eyes glow with lethal intensity as he unleashes a devastating blast of energy, piercing through Kyle's skull and ending his life in an instant. Back at the house, Tori frantically tries to call Kyle, her heart sinking as she receives no answer. Finally, Brandon picks up the phone, coldly informing Tori that Kyle is gone and that he's on his way home. Hanging up, Brandon begins a destructive rampage through the house, flying at breakneck speed, tearing it apart with frightening ease. With no other options, Tori dials 911 as Brandon continues his chaotic destruction around her. The sheriff and his deputy are dispatched, responding to the distress call. Arriving at the scene, they witness the devastation wrought by Brandon's power. Tori emerges from the wreckage, attempting to communicate with the sheriff, but before she can speak, Brandon charges forward, tearing the sheriff apart in a gruesome display of violence. Panic-stricken, Tori and the deputy seek refuge inside the house. Tori hides upstairs as the deputy, armed and trembling, searches for Brandon. She calls for backup as she cautiously moves through the shattered remains of the house. Suddenly, Brandon appears before her, then vanishes, leaving the deputy vulnerable and exposed. The chilling sounds of violence echo through the house as Tori listens in horror, realizing the deputy's fate at the hands of her own son. With nowhere to run and her worst fears realized, Tori braces herself for the inevitable confrontation with the unstoppable force that is Brandon. Continuing to remain quiet, Tori stealthily makes her way out of the window and crashes to the ground below. Gathering her resolve, she heads towards the barn where the meteor is located, recalling a pivotal moment when Brandon was injured during his fall, prompting her to rip off a shard from the meteor for protection. In the barn, Tori discovers the lifeless body of the waitress, a grim reminder of the devastation wrought by her own son. Concealing the shard, Tori calls out for Brandon, who appears hooded and enigmatic. Despite her fear, Tori professes her unwavering love for her son, attempting to connect with the innocent boy she once knew. As Tori moves to remove Brandon's hood, he gazes at her with apparent innocence, momentarily stirring her maternal instincts. Seizing the opportunity, Tori prepares to strike, but Brandon catches her hand, thwarting her plans. Enraged, he retaliates by lifting Tori into the air, holding her aloft several hundred feet above ground. With a chilling finality, Brandon releases Tori from his grasp, allowing her to plummet to her death. As she falls, an oncoming plane approaches Brandon in the sky. The next day, the wreckage from the crash is shown on the ground, with no survivors reported. Tragically, the plane had collided with a farmhouse, claiming the lives of Kyle and Tori. Meanwhile, Brandon sits amidst the devastation, innocently eating a cookie, his true nature hidden beneath a facade of innocence. During the end credits, scenes of cities in ruin and millions perishing at Brandon's hands serve as a haunting reminder of the cataclysmic impact of his unchecked power.